You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Haristadoulou.
Welcome back to the Greeks Gridiron. I am Ethan Haristadoulou, continuing on with our free agency discussions. Today, we are at team number 3 in the rankings of most cap space, as the Washington Commanders are up next for some discussion. So Commanders fans, with an estimated $79.5 million in cap space, according to Spotrac, I would like to hear from you all. Who do you want to see your team retain and sign going through this year's free agency and offseason period? Fire away in that comment section. You're looking at 28. Let me stress that again. 28 total unrestricted free agents, with a 29th guy, if you want to throw on the list, that's a restricted free agent going into this offseason. There are a ton of players that this team could potentially bring back, allow to walk, and then of course that leaves the door wide open for some decent structural changes along the roster. And after what we saw from the Commanders last season, I'm kind of here for it, because this is a team that went out and flipped their roster quite a bit last year, and they hit on a number of guys, and I trust the front office, I trust the scouts, I trust all what they're doing over there coaching-wise as well, to maybe go out, bring in another new crop of guys to not just flip the roster again, but upgrade the roster even further. So we'll start with re-signings first. I have 2 guys that I'm kind of banging the table for as far as retaining for the Commanders, and then I have a third honorable mention guy that I would love to kind of just like open up the floor to you Commanders fans and hear your thoughts on him. I'm not a Commanders fan. I follow the whole league, so I am obviously going to take some of your opinions a little bit stronger than my own here when it comes to that one. But first, the guy that is at the top of my list for re-signings, it's got to be none other than linebacker Bobby Wagner. Spotrac estimates that he's probably going to need to be brought back on a deal that's somewhere around $7 million or so, maybe even a little bit more, because he did have himself another good season, over 100 tackles, 13th straight season to be exact, with over 100 tackles in a year. For me, this is really all about just retaining leadership, retaining a guy who knows how to win and knows how to play in the middle of the defense at the highest of levels. Sure, he's a little bit older. He's mid-30s at this point in his career, but Bobby Wagner's brain is clearly bigger than most surrounding him, because he, even at his quote-unquote advanced age, is still getting the job done better than some guys that are maybe 10 years younger than he is in their mid-20s. This is a crucial piece to just keep in the middle of that defense, even if he is maybe not the number one guy. At $7 million with a cap that is sitting at $275 million now altogether. This is a literal no-brainer. And I honestly think it would be a travesty to see the Commanders let him walk. He is an impact guy, even if it's not necessarily at the same level of play. Again, even though he's still literally all over the football field, maybe just a hair slower than what he was before. This is one that you can't let walk. He was integral to helping flip that defense last season, and I think he will continue to be a big piece of that, even if his play ends up being a little more limited because you draft somebody else or you bring somebody else in to maybe improve the linebacker room even further. Bobby Wagner's a leader. He's done it. He knows how to do it. He knows how to win and what it takes to win on the defensive side of the football. He was a part of one of the greatest defenses we've seen over the last couple of decades in Seattle when they won the Super Bowl and nearly back-to-back against the Patriots the year following. So this is a guy that I absolutely want to see Washington bring back. The other person that I'm really interested in seeing, because I think he had a really good first year in the system, and I'm very interested in seeing Dan Quinn and Joe Witt continue to find just even more ways to push him through this defense and really see what you can get out of him, and that's going to be safety Jeremy Chinn. Spotrac estimates his contract to be somewhere around $6 million, maybe a little bit north of that for 3 years. So you're looking at an $18 million to $20 million contract in totality. Maybe it ends up being a little bit more than that. That number feels maybe somewhat low because he's now kind of sandwiched a really good year, or a good year overall, I would say, especially considering he joins a new system, with a couple of years behind that were not so great and a couple of strong first 2 seasons to his 5-year career to this point now. For me, this is, again, more so about me trusting Dan Quinn and Joe Witt to continue to elevate his game even further. And he was asked to do a lot in this defense this past season for somebody who literally came in that offseason and was trying to grasp a new defense coming from Carolina. He played the most snaps at free safety that he's ever played in his career, 132 more than his second highest, which was during his rookie season. And he also played the most snaps of his career in a season overall, north of 1,200 total. I believe the next highest he had was somewhere in the ballpark of a little bit over 1,000. So for me, this is just from a 1,000-foot view, you're looking at a guy that you paid not a lot of money for in all things considered. This was a one-year prove-it type of deal. I definitely would say, especially towards the back half of the season, you got your money's worth and maybe even a little bit more. Maybe the beginning, early part of the season, a little bit of a slower start. So what? Fair, obviously, new system, getting your feet wet in this defense. But towards that back half of the year, I think we really started to see Jeremy Chinn come on strong. And this is one that, again, if you're paying him $6, $7, $8 million per year on a 3-year deal, where you can probably get out in 2 years anyways, because that's the way these contracts in the NFL seem to be structured nowadays anyways, this is a no-brainer. Keep this guy on your defense. He has proven that he can play at a very high level. This is Defensive Rookie of the Year from the year he came out of the draft. He's had some really good seasons, but there have been a couple of not so great ones mixed in between, if you want to point to injuries and maybe just it was at the Carolina Panthers. So, sorry, Panthers fans, to just take a shot there, but that is what that is. So, I mean, I feel like with Dan Quinn, with Joe Witt, under their tutelage, this is a guy who could continue to flourish and become an even bigger piece of this defense here. And I think he's got all the physical tools you need. I think he's got it up there mentally as well. So this is a guy I definitely think at that price point is a no-brainer if you can have him there. The third guy that I have, and this is not me really banging the table for him, more so is just kind of bringing it up because I liked what I saw from him towards the tail end of the season. I thought he was coming up in some really big spots. And when you look at the wide receiver room in Washington right now, you have 2 guys that are slated to come back that are currently on contract. Everyone else is set to hit free agency, including this guy here, and that is wide receiver Dyami Brown. I would say that keeping at least 3 wide receivers from this past season would be good for consistency's sake. You could probably be fine with the fact that you're keeping McLaurin and Luke McCaffrey and restructuring the rest of the room, but I think maybe keeping a guy like Dyami Brown, who, when you look at what he did the last few games of the season, sans the lost to the Philadelphia Eagles, which in hindsight now, did you even really want to hold that much against him, because that defense was clearly on another level at that point, and Philadelphia was a wagon at that point. So the way I see it right now, you look at some of his performances, especially against Tampa Bay, in Detroit, in the playoffs, and just those last handful, I would say 6 or so games of the season where it felt like he was really building a good rapport with Jaden Daniels and coming up in some big spots. This is about keeping consistency in the wide receiver room and just keeping a guy that clearly Jaden Daniels started to trust in some of the brighter moments of Jaden Daniels' young career to this point here, especially when you look at those playoff numbers. So let me hear from you on that one, Commanders fans. Again, I would be fine if they let him walk, but also, again, for consistency's sake, and once more, it seemed like they found a little bit of a rhythm together late in the year. Maybe keep him around, even if he ends up being wide receiver 4 or 5. I don't really think that the contract they're going to have to hand him is going to be anything bigger than a 1 or 2 year deal for a few $1 million. And again, we're in a league now where we're looking at $275 million in cap space. Commanders sitting at nearly $80 million. They have to bring a decent amount of guys back. I could see Dyami Brown as one of those guys. Now, let's get into the fun stuff. Free agents. Who does this team need to target to upgrade their defense and look better on that defensive side of the ball? Now, I have 3 guys, keeping the list short and simple here. These are some of the people that I would really be interested in seeing Washington bring in, not necessarily who I expect. Some of them I would be less surprised than others to see them bring in. This first one, a little bit outside of the box, but I do think could be an improvement on the defensive line, working opposite of Dorrance Armstrong. I would like to see them go and target defensive end from Kansas City, Charles Omenihu, at just 27 years old. Spotrac is estimating he's going to get something along the lines of a $12 million per year, 4-year type of deal, which, considering the position he plays and some of the production that Kansas City has gotten from him, and obviously last season only played 6 games, didn't get a ton of production. He came back late off of a tough injury following the 2023 season. But when looking at that 2023 season, he had himself a really good year and was coming up in some of the biggest spots you needed. And for me, this is about finding a running mate that works opposite of Dorrance Armstrong, who's coming off his first full-fledged season as a legitimate starter after playing in Dallas. Only 5 sacks in his first season as a starter. I expect that number to, again, improve working under the tutelage of Joe Witt and Dan Quinn. And then you, of course, bring in a guy like Charles Omenihu, who has shown he can be a productive pass rusher, and it's not something that's necessarily going to break the bank. And the reason I'm looking at a guy like Omenihu, who, again, about $12 million per year. That's not going to kill you in terms of how much money you need to give up to get a guy like him in. And while, yes, we just discussed $80 million nearly in cap space for the Commanders, I also made sure to include that 28 unrestricted free agents that are potentially going to hit the market for Washington. There's a decent amount of guys that either have to get brought back or be replaced. So while you have $80 million to work with, the number is it's not as what you would think it is because of how much is going to have to be spent on bringing guys back. So the way I see it, Omenihu improves the defensive line. I think he would be an upgrade opposite of Dorrance Armstrong, and he's not going to kill you when it comes to breaking the bank. And he's young enough that he has time to continue to develop, and I trust Dan Quinn and Joe Witt to get the most out of him. The second person I have, we're sticking to the defensive line, defensive heavy for this one here, because for me, I think Omenihu would be nice as far as setting the edge on one side for that defensive line, but also beefing up the interior a little bit. There's been a lot of conversation about the Commanders' defensive tackles and just what needs to be done there, and maybe some of the lack of production that you have been getting from the interior of the defensive line. And I almost am starting to think, the more I read about the situation and just how people feel, there is a good chance that maybe we see some changes on the interior of the defensive line. And if that were to happen, this is where I think it could start as far as bringing somebody new in, and that's going to be Bengals defensive tackle B.J. Hill. At 30 years old, defensive lineman, they can play well into their 30s, so this is one of those things where it's like, I'm not too worried about him being at 30. Spotrack's thinking something along the lines of like $9 million or so per year on a 2-3 year deal, something like that. Once again, not a ton of money, but somebody that I do think could be an upgrade to the defensive line, alongside with Omenihu, being brought in. And again, we're not breaking the bank here. He was credited, according to NFL Pro's statistics here, at 43 defensive stops last season, and was also credited for 3 sacks and 56 tackles throughout the year. This is about beefing up the interior of the defensive line. Washington, one of the worst run defenses in the NFL, and we saw that for a good portion of the year, and it kind of came to fruition on play number 1 of that playoff game against the Philadelphia Eagles in the NFC Championship. So for me, B.J. Hill, big man in the middle, if there are going to be some changes on that defensive line, and especially on the interior side as well, because it maybe doesn't feel like you're quite getting your money's worth out of it right now. B.J. Hill's a guy that I actually targeted for the Bengals before they brought him in, and I think he was great for them on the interior. And with a change at defensive coordinator, with Lou Anarumo departing from the Bengals, I think there is a good chance that we see some restructuring going on in that defense over there, and B.J. Hill being available seems very realistic in my eyes. The last guy, we'll flip to the offensive side, and we touched on wide receiver already. Now, like I said, cap room at $80 million for the Commanders is a little bit of fool's gold, because it's the number is not what it seems with how many people either need to be signed to new deals to come back or just be replaced overall with the 28 total unrestricted free agents. But if there is one big money splash, and there's a reason I kind of held back on the spending on the last 2 guys I brought up here, I have held this guy away from the first 2 teams I discussed because this is my dream scenario here. Although it does seem unlikely now, but the point will still hold true as far as targeting another running mate for Terry McLaurin. If T. Higgins ends up being available, if for whatever reason they're so far apart on contract talks and Cincinnati opts to, not tag T. Higgins, despite the fact that it sounds like they're going to, I would love to see Washington go and get T. Higgins and bring him in to absolutely maximize Jaden Daniels' time on his rookie contract and working alongside a guy like Terry McLaurin for a season. This is truly and strictly about maximizing your offensive potential and Jaden Daniels' upside here. Now, the way I see this number going, it's going to cost, Spotrac has it estimated at $25 or so million per year. I think it's going to be north of that. There's a good chance if he hits the market, if keyword if, then that number is probably going to get pushed closer to 30 million. And if it's like I think Washington benefits from being a good, stable organization now. And after what they've shown in year 1 under an entire regime change, becomes a far more attractive landing spot. they probably get closer to that 30 million or so, something along the lines. I think some of those teams that have maybe more money to spend are probably going to have to pay even higher than that to convince him to go there. Whereas Washington, getting the opportunity to play with a Jaden Daniels who looked so good his rookie season, T. Higgins would probably be willing to take $1 million or $2 million or less, because the upside for his career and potential earning power later on in his career working with Daniels would far exceed going to maybe a place like Las Vegas, where you don't necessarily know what the quarterback situation holds over there going forward. Could they be bringing in Sam Darnold or Aaron Rodgers or Kirk Cousins, or drafting a guy in this year's draft that nobody really seems to be sold on as like high first round selections, but will go out of necessity in those top 5 picks? So the way I see it, get T. Higgins if he's available. If it's not T. Higgins, the point still stands that I would really love to see the Washington Commanders, whether it's through trade or if somebody else hits the market by surprise, because there's always a few guys that just randomly get released that nobody was really anticipating. That's the beauty of the mystery between now and free agency. You never really know who's going to end up being available. I would love to see Washington go after and get another really strong wide receiver to work opposite of Terry McLaurin, because McLaurin's been carrying his water and other people's water for a long stretch of his career with no real help opposite of him. I would love to see him get a legit running mate. I don't anticipate Terry McLaurin ever going anywhere. He seems like a commander for life kind of guy. So get him somebody who can work alongside him the next 3 or 4 years and again help you really maximize what you have budding right now with Jaden Daniels. I think a number 2 or a really strong 1A, 1B situation would be huge for what this Washington Commanders offense could potentially do. And again, I kept T. Higgins away from the Patriots and Raiders, who I've already discussed, because if again, huge if, because of what's been coming out news-wise, if he becomes available, this is where I would love to see T. Higgins go. It's a match made in heaven, and it would just be absolutely awesome to watch this offense explode next year if T. Higgins was playing opposite of Terry. And if it's not T. Higgins, you go find the best guy that's possibly available, see what you can make with an offense, again, 1A, 1B situation, or a 1 and a really strong number 2 opposite of Terry McLaurin, and you've got yourself a really fun offense to look forward to next year. But that's what I'm looking at for free agency for the Commanders. Fire away again. As always, let me know in that comment section down below. But if you made it to the end, I greatly appreciate it, and I'll see you all next time. Have a good one.